Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us the first day of the Kushala Literature Festival here in the city of Nawabs, Lucknow. And what better way to begin this festival than with a conversation on this city and its myriad pasts that Ira you have covered. And your book and your various books before go on to show that history is much more complicated than the single layer narratives that sometimes we superimpose on them. And I think that's the same for your latest work. But before I reach into the world of the Nawabs of Awadh, I want to ask you that previously you worked on these very with elegant prose, vivid narrative histories of the Mughals and the women of the Mughal Empire. So, what got you knocking at the doors of the Nawabs in Lucknow?
Yes, thank you so much, Eric, for the question. Thank you to everyone for being here and for being part of this wonderful festival. So, as Eric was saying, when I began my writing career, I was particularly interested in the forgotten roles of many women, the way in which women have influenced culture and history in this country, and around the world. We are now coming to realize that a lot of the histories of women have been forgotten, either intentionally or just by neglect over the centuries. And so that was one area that I started exploring with my first few books, Heroines and even Song of Draupadi, in mythology in India and in history. And I sort of came to this conclusion that there was a lot of information about women lying around there, but there was just no will to get those stories across. And so then I wrote Daughters of the Sun, which took a lot of effort because I was initially told that there is no information about Mughal women. They were one certain way, and that's all we know about them. So often, when you came to texts about the Mughal, for example, and I started with the Mughals because I'm someone who's grown up in Delhi, so they were close to me both physically and as the framework to my thinking all my life, because they are there in all the monuments in Delhi. They are there even in the language we speak in Delhi, in the songs we sing, the language, the way we use languages. The Mughal culture is really, really very, very visceral in a place like Delhi, which has been one of their great, capitals. So I started with the Mughal women, and despite being told that there was no available evidence, there was a lot of it. It was just like, forgotten, undiscovered, and slowly now some historians like Ruby Lal have been bringing these stories out. So when I started writing these books and I started to get a little bit of recognition and being invited to speak on various things, I noticed that little by little I was asked to speak on panels which were about women's histories, or specifically about the stories told by women to women. And I realized that this was just one more way to sort of invisibilize or diminish the importance of women's stories by you sort of put them into a niche. And so there's almost um, a double sense of ugly, because it's not just my subject matter, the women, but it is me as a woman historian. So there's a double sense of being an attempt being made to erase one's story and one's effort. So I thought, instead of focusing primarily on women, I would just look at whatever period in history fascinated me and make sure that the women were brought back into those stories. So I would make them center stage rather than a chapter. So, until then, not always, but often you would find a story about, say, an emperor, and the Zinana or the women's stories would be one chapter, somewhere between kitchens and horse rearing, for example, as if women were static in one place, contained and, easily sort of, described. So I thought, so with my next work, which was Akbar, it was quite a challenge to write about an emperor like Akbar and to bring in the women. But then the more I looked into it, the more I realized so many of his policies to do with the Rajputs, especially the way in which he was able to nurture syncretic culture, was because of his early marriages with Rajput princesses. So I was able to, talk a lot more about women in that book than I think other historians may have done till then when they were addressing a typically male subject like a biography of Akbar. So that's how it started, that I started looking just outside the scope of purely women centric works. But I hope it's a nefarious way to nonetheless bring the women, into the spotlight.
So, you talked about how it often happens, and I think this is a practice in historiography. It's just become a process where topics that have been niche or considered niche either get a chapter, or you say, well, there is not enough source to build this. Or there are sometimes instances where the sources that we are referring to have really colored the perception of the people in a certain way. And I think that has been the case with the Nawab story too. Because if I remember, and if anybody here was in CBSE history, even in class 12th, the entire Nawab story was intertwined with the movement of 1857, and it was a colonial story. And thus, I think the colonial historiographies that were manufactured, and even you talk about this in your book, and I just want to cite a little example, that they would think of the Nawab as this extravagant personality and their expenditures as unnecessary, but they were not going into their coffers, and that was part of the reason. So, do you think when you began working on this book, and we'll come to the sources later, what were the sort of historiographies that were coloring the perceptions of the Nawabs already?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because exactly like you say, our idea of the Nawab, especially I'm talking about people outside of Lucknow itself, any of us from outside, from the north, I speak for myself and a lot of my colleagues in Delhi. The idea we have of the Nawabs of Awadh is the abiding image of Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, as depicted in Shatranj Ki Khiladi, which is a beautiful movie, but it shows the Nawab as this helpless, debauched, events overtaking him, someone caught in the past, helplessly caught in the past. And it was very much my idea of what Lucknow and the Nawabs were like. But of course, as Eric was saying, when you really look into what was happening, the rise of the Nawabs exactly coincided with the incursions of the British East India Company and the French East India Company, of course. We'll come to that later, but the British East India Company. And so they very much wrote the records. And I came across, a small text which told me that in 1947, at the time of independence, when the British were leaving India, as they started to leave all their ex colonies, there was a huge fire in which they would throw all the documents from the country that incriminated their rules in these various countries. So they either destroyed these manuscripts outright or they took them back to hide them from prying eyes and hid them in various, archives in England, and they're not very easily available even today. It was something called Operation Legacy because the British wanted to make sure that we remember them with respect and affection. That was written in the, in the letters giving these orders. So it became very clear to me that the British had one particular point of view and narrative that they wanted to make sure that we remembered about the Nawabs, and one of which was exactly this, that they were effete, they were debauched, they were incapable of ruling their country, because the more you can charge a ruler of being incapable, the more you can then, give sort of assign to yourself the role of rulership. And they started, imposing all these very strict regulations on things like household expenses. The first thing they did with the Nawabs was firstly they cut back their military expenses, and then they tried to cut down on household expenses. And the first time I heard this, I was reading the literature and I thought, okay, household expenses sounds fair enough. You try and cut back your expenses. But what they meant by that was that the Nawabs patronized this enormous culture of singing, dance, poetry, of course, their cuisines as well. And all of these cultural sort of, houses that arose in Lucknow were completely fostered by the Nawabs and the elite who were spending money to patronize all of these artisans, who a lot of whom came from Delhi. So once you cut back on these expenses, these household expenses, which sound very innocent, you actually wipe away an entire way of being, an entire system, an entire culture. I read somewhere that one entire gharana came to an end overnight. Uh, because patronage was pulled out, the Nawabs had to pull patronage for that gharana, of music and dance and poetry. So it takes a lot of effort to counter the sort of effort that the British put in spinning this, and they were really masters of spin, and they spun out the story of the Nawabs being really ineffectual rulers. And the more I looked at, especially the early rulers like Shuja-ud-Dawla, that was so patently untrue, and that the more they had to say this in their records clearly, the greater was the strength of the Nawab because they had to put so much effort into undermining his rule and thereby justifying their own incursions and gradual seizing of power for themselves.
I'm glad that you mentioned Shatranj Ki Khiladi and the idea that there is a way in which we imagine places, even for the British. The idea of the rope trick and the elephant and the prince were, the tropes through which India was defined. But Nawab Wajid Ali Shah is truly a figure that has peeled from school textbooks. That entire exile, when the whole of Lucknow is on the streets lamenting, crying for their Nawab, all the way to 1970s in New Delhi, when a woman arrives at the New Delhi railway station and says, "I am the descendant of Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, and we were exiled since then." So it is a memory that people do hold on to. But I'm glad that you mentioned Shuja, because I do want to ask you that in this exploration of different Nawabs or any personality that defined the socio-political landscape of the time, who stood out for you?
So, in terms of the Lucknowis, I have to say that Shujaudollah was one of my surprises because I had not even come across him, at all until then. Asafudollah a little bit really because of all his buildings here in Lucknow to begin with. But Shujaudollah was this hidden character, and when the more I found out about him, the more extraordinary I realized he was because he was this man who became Nawab at a very young age. So he was the third Nawab, and when Safdarjung died unexpectedly, and Safdarjung was really more of a Delhi courtier. He was the man whose career spanned the courts of the Delhi emperors. But Shujaudollah, so he became a Nawab very early. He was a man who was very impulsive, very charismatic, very energetic. An early account of him from the British said that the first thing he would do in the morning, get up at dawn, jump onto his horse, go for a hectic bout of hunting, elephants and tigers, come back, jump into a cold water bath, and spend the afternoon in the zanana, and that's all he spent his time doing. So he was a man, raised. He was born and bred as a Nawab. He was used to that sort of largesse, that opulence in his life. He was used to taking, having life, all the good things in life handed to him in a platter. But the minute the Battle of Buxar happened in 1764, he realized that the topography of India had changed completely. He instantly recognized the British for the menace that they were. Very few Indian rulers actually did at that time and even later. He recognized this, he recognized the weakness that he had in Awadh, and he played his cards really, really well diplomatically. And secondly, all the energy that he had used till then hunting, lions and other things, he poured into Lucknow, and he really into Faizabad, sorry, because his capital was really Faizabad with Bahu Begum and Nawab Begum. He completely transformed the geography of that country. He changed the fortunes of its military. But even though the British put a lot of strictures on him after the Battle of Buxar and the treaty he was forced to sign, he signed the treaty but then came back and pretty much did what he wanted to. He retained his military strength. He trained them along European lines. He invested in building new structures. And he attracted talent just by this largesse that he started, indulging in. He attracted the best of Delhi's talents, the poets, the painters, the craftsperson. This really became a hub for creativity and for people to come to. And so that transformation that happens in Shujaudollah, from one extreme almost to the other, and at the same time, everybody loved him, even his enemies, even the British. Somehow they couldn't fail to be charmed by him when they were in his presence. He was somebody who was so commanding, who had so much natural magnetism and charisma. And he knew how to use the skills that he had despite the fairly tricky hand that he had been dealt after the Battle of Buxar. So I find him, and he and his son were really responsible for keeping the British at bay, and it is only after the death of Asafudollah that they made large inroads into Awadh.
So this does go on to show, as you talk about cultural patronage and the artistic traditions that were flourishing, there was always keenness to maintain a robust political and invest in that political, logistics, so that you could counter what was happening to your region. But you mentioned that he was able to attract a lot of the gems of, chroniclers, poets. And I do want you to expand on that world a little bit because, much like women, a lot of times even poets and chroniclers and tawaifs are reduced to statics as they were just doing one thing. A courtesan was always just in a room in her ada with a whiskey, and the poets were always just writing poetry in their Persian jackets, much like the one I'm wearing. So, could you take us into the multi-layeredness of that world and how that truly defined Lucknow?
Yes, that's a fabulous question and a fabulous jacket. Yeah, so just before we come to the actual multi-layered world, a small aside on what Eric started off with is that the 18th century was for a long time, narrated to us as a time of slow degradation of the Mughal center, and thereby leading to a sort of almost lassitude in all of India as everybody sort of succumbed to this inertia as the Mughal lost power at the center in Delhi. Actually, now scholars are revisiting this completely, art historians and other scholars, and they are saying that rather than seeing it as a complete breakdown all over India, what actually happened was yes, the Mughal center became much weaker because the Mughal emperor no longer had the power he once did, especially after Buxar, but it simply meant that political power and cultural power shifted to the so-called sub-imperial centers like Hyderabad, like Mysore, like Murshidabad, like the Rajput courts, and like Awadh. So we need to, renegotiate the ideas we had of these places just sort of sitting in a sort of torpor, waiting for the end to come, which was really what the British meant, was waiting for the British to come, like on their shining, as the shining knights in armor. So these sub-imperial centers became, extremely powerful in their own right and navigated these changing currents in very exciting ways. So we see the way in which, for example, in architecture, the Nawabs of Awadh began in Safdarjung's tomb in Delhi. So that is a tomb which was long considered the last flicker, as it's described, the last flicker in the flame of Mughal architecture, because it was considered a poor example of, say, Humayun's tomb. But now scholars have re-examined this. Young scholars like Chanchal Dadlani have said that actually, no, if you really look at it, look at the elements of it. Yes, it has many Mughal attributes to it. It has the dome that we all recognize, the Chahar Bagh, but it has a certain something in its decoration, in its stucco, plaster work, lime work inside, which shows a sort of, almost an energy, an efflorescence, which will really find its final shape here in Faizabad and Lucknow as these centers develop new ways in negotiating a crumbling Mughal power. So it's their way of saying, yes, the Mughals are very mighty and they were very mighty once, but we are now the new contenders on the block. So similarly, as Eric was saying, all these craftspeople were attracted by the patronage of the Nawabs and the elite, because even as an artist, you can't live on love and air alone. So you go to where the money is, and the money was very much here. And so you had all these, poets and all these courtesans and all the rest coming in here, and they created this really vibrant society, first in Faizabad, which was the first capital of the Nawabs. We know how important, for example, the courtesans were. And the courtesans, we are really needing to now re-examine what we believe to be the role of a courtesan entirely. It is more like the Japanese geisha. These were very cultured, educated, talented, beautiful women. We have a long culture in India of having women like this called Ganika. It began, in ancient India, where a city would pour resources into a talented child, and there would be yes, and ustads would be assigned to that talented child and see if they developed any talent for singing or dancing or entertainment. The city, all of the city would put some money into this person. So it was a very expensive education that these courtesans, Ganikas got. And so we have a long tradition of such women. It was really, I think, again in 1857, the British realized, and Vina Oldenburg, Professor Vina Oldenburg has done work where she found that at 1857, when the records were seized here in Lucknow, the highest taxpayers were the courtesans. The highest taxpayers in a city which was already very, very wealthy. So you can imagine the kind of money, resources that they attracted, that they had at their disposal. And they were often found to be, supporting the people who resisted the British, because the British didn't appreciate the culture. So It was very interesting when I looked at the way Asaf Uddaulah did his majlis, for example, or his entertainments. So in the mornings, he would meet the British resident or whoever was visiting. He would have a breakfast a la English, and serve them custard and jellies and all sorts of things like that. He would put on a puppet show and mimicries because he knew that they wouldn't understand the nuance of language. They wouldn't understand Urdu. But in the evening, he would bring on the poets, he would bring on the dancers, because that was a completely different elite society who was open to that kind of very, very developed culture. As a result, the British wrote about the Nawab of Asafudollah in particular and said, "Oh, he's very childish in his likes and dislikes. He takes enjoyment in puppet shows and in comedians and comics," not realizing that they were completely barred from the evening entertainments where all the really nuanced culture was being played out for a discerning citizenry. So the courtesans and the poets, they were very much part and parcel of the society. They were all the elite patrons were vying with each other to have them perform at their homes. And so it was a really, really rich kind of cultural scene that was playing out kind of hidden behind doors from the British.
Incredible. And the fact that they were the highest taxpayers, I think that would come as a surprise to a lot of people. But again, I think we're talking about them defining the socio-political landscape in ways beyond the historiographical static. The same way for the bustling world of the Avadi Zenana and the women of, the kings, wherein we see even for Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, the Begum emerging out of the shadows once he leaves, or at least in the narratives. So, what about the Begum story? And yet again, this has also been reduced to a niche.
The Begum story, especially at this period, 18th century, is really fascinating and really forgotten. So we begin with Nawab Begum, who was the wife of Safdarjung and who was really an extraordinary woman in her own right here in Delhi. At one point when her house was under threat, she climbed onto the roof of her Haveli in Old Delhi and mobilized her soldiers and said, "We will fight for the safety of our house," because her husband was away, he wasn't in Delhi. But Begum is really one of the extraordinary women, forgotten women in history. I think we remember here in Lucknow, but basically she is quite forgotten considering the role she played. So Bahu Begum was Shujauddaullah's main wife. He had many, many women. He was quite an enthusiast of women, so he married many, and he had many courtesans whom he had liaisons with. But Bahu Begum was his main wife, and her influence begins at the time of the Battle of Buxar because though the British negotiate a peace with Shujauddaulah finally, they impose a huge war indemnity of 50 lakhs rupees, a lot of money for that time. And nobody is willing to cough up that money for Shujauddaulah, who is by this time, completely ruined. He spent all his money fighting the British. And Bahu Begum, goes to her trousseau, takes out whatever jewelry and brocade cloths and utensils she has from her fabulously extravagant wedding, and gives him what is necessary to pay off his debts. And from that time onwards, Shujauddaulah recognizes the kind of woman he has in his wife. And when they come back to Faizabad and set up their capital here, he deposits all his surplus treasury with her, single-handedly. She's the biggest. She controls the largest amount of money as an individual in Faizabad. She also has the seals to the government. And so she is this person who controls all this enormous treasury. I mean, amounts beyond our imagination today. And when Shujauddaulah dies, Governor General Hastings is very keen to get his hands on this treasure because of events which are happening far away. Today we may not have time to talk about it a great deal, but a lot of the happenings in India in the 18th century are actually driven by global Franco-English wars. Especially the American War of Independence that was happening between 1775 to 1782 approximately. And this is exactly when the British national debt goes from 74 million pounds to 224 million pounds. And the British government is in dire straits because they have spent all their money basically losing their American colonies, who become independent of the British. So Governor General Hastings has orders to get money from India to make up the hole that has been generated from American wars. And one of the first place he thinks to look at is Benares, Raja Chet Singh, and then Lucknow and Faizabad. And he comes here demanding money. And Bahu Begum stands up to him and refuses to give them, her money, because she knows that's the source of her power. If she gives them her money, she is nothing anymore. And she holds face to them and she resists them for years. Her Khwaja Saras, her eunuchs, are imprisoned to try and find out where she's got her money, but they're unable to get anything, even after years of really intense torture, psychological torture, and keeping her imprisoned in her own palace. And finally, she gives them a token amount, and she's then left alone. And Hastings is called back to face trial because of the way in which he treated this, Indian elite woman. So after that, after Shuja-ud-Dawla dies, Asaf-ud-Dawla goes to Lucknow, and his capital will always be Lucknow. But Bahu Begum and Nawab Begum at the same time patronize a culture in their capital of Faizabad. And it's extraordinary to think of these parallel capitals happening together. Asaf-ud-Dawla recognizing the power and prestige of his mother and grandmother, allowing them to carry on. And they have a huge retinue, many soldiers, many courtesans and singers and poets attached to their court. But interestingly, one of the historians of that time tells us that these ladies didn't like the sort of frantic pace that was happening in Lucknow. They preferred the old style, the Mughal style from Delhi, because after all, they weren't Delhi women. They came from the Delhi nobility. So I like to try and imagine what their idea of a more sedate style was. Maybe it was more pastels and less flashy jewelry like the Lucknowis were starting to wear at this time.
Truly staggering saga, and each of these characters lend themselves to stories on their own, which is much like history because we're talking about humans with much more layers to them. So, before we open to the audience, just one last thing. I think we are seeing a very welcoming change in the way in which histories are being written now, wherein art is being given its rightful place. And you mentioned even about Safdarjung's tomb. I think for those who have not been to Delhi, you'd be surprised to know how many things are named after Safdarjung. That enclave, hospitals, and of course you have the tomb. And here too, when you come to Lucknow, this is my first time in Lucknow, and I know which darwazas I must see, which Imam Baras I see. So architecture truly defines the way in which you absorb a place and therefore the past. So tell us about some of your visual histories exploration and what stood out to you here, perhaps Dilkusha.
Dilkusha, so there's a Dilkusha in Faizabad. Yeah. So I came for sort of field work research when I was writing this book, and I spent some time here. And I visited Faizabad as well. And Dilkusha, which was Shuja-ud-Dawla's palace complex, he built 6 brand new palace complex in Faizabad. And it still exists, which is an extraordinary thing. It's really, really stunningly beautiful. It is right on the border of what would have been the Ghagra at that time. Now it has changed its course a little bit. But we still see, the Shah Jahani arches. We see so much of the beautiful decoration and the buildings remaining, but it is in really a very, very sorry and poor state. And I would encourage people to take more of an interest in what Faizabad has to offer as well. Some extraordinary stuff. But just to add on to your point, Eric, is that we are really learning a lot by looking at visual culture now. Even the amount I've learned through this particular book, you can really have a sense of the ambition of the Nawab when you look at their buildings, like the Imam Bara that Asaf-ud-Dawla built, had the largest vaulted, unsupported vaulted space in the world ever created. And we've completely forgotten that kind of thing. The decorations that they used were completely novel. So you will all be familiar with the symbol of the fish. So that was very new at this time. It was, an honor which had been given to the Nawab, the Mahi Maharatib honor, the honor of the fish, and they started using this in all of their decorative elements, and it was taken on, into jewelry as well. You see it on cloths as well. And it was almost like a stamp, showing your identity through a brand logo, saying these are the Nawabs, this is the influence of the Nawabs. And interestingly, everybody, all the people sort of took this up. Whenever they were building something, they would put this fish symbol, they would use this stucco work, very vibrant vegetal sort of work that was happening even in Hindu temples and Jain temples. So it is a cross religious, it is not a matter of faith, it's really a matter of culture. So that people felt bound together. By this culture which was being encouraged at all levels by the enormous largesse that the Nawabs were willing to spend. So the visual culture, and we haven't even begun talking about art and the miniatures that were created at that time. Again, it is something that that used to be considered very second rate, compared to the high Shah Jahani Mughal miniatures, and now is being re-evaluated because the way in which you understand and interpret miniatures has been changed by young scholars working today, and they're giving us so much more insight. If you buy a copy of my book, you will know more about it.
Which is what is your task right now. Thank you, Ira. Truly, truly a staggering saga, and there is so much to go into this, but that's what we are saying. If you want to know the full story, please get the book. If we have any questions from the audience, we will take them now, but we are running a bit short on time.
I just wanted to compliment you for your wonderful eloquence in bringing out the kind of stuff you've written about.
Thank you.
And I think it deserves a huge round of applause from the limited audience we have here. But actually, it's a pity because the Lucknowis need to hear about it more. I mean,
Thank you so much.
very gracious of you to come over to us to talk about the Avdi
It's a
culture.
pleasure. Thank you.
But the only thing which is bothering me is the source of. He mentioned something. The anchor was mentioning something about the sources from which you must have drawn inspiration and written about the book. And the second thing which was bothering me because were the courtesans really paying taxes or was it some kind of extortion? You know, when you made that point that they were paying taxes, I had inverted commas around it. So could you please elaborate on that?
So the sources is an interesting question. Of course, I have a very detailed list of sources in my books, but some of the interesting source material I was able to find. So, for the world of the Zenana of Bahu Begum and Nawab Begum, there's a book written by an insider. Somebody who was an assistant to one of the great Khwaja Saras, Jawahar Ali Khan's assistant, right hand man, we can say. He wrote a book, Faiz Baksh. He wrote a book which is really a very unique document written from inside, a space which is normally hidden to us. And he tells us all sorts of stories of what was happening in the Zenana. So this was told to me by a Dastan Go actually, which shows us that sometimes serious historians don't give the same importance to certain sources. So if a eunuch writes something or a woman writes something, it's often forgotten in favor of, say a famous male historian. So this Dastan Go brought this to my notice, and I have gone back to it so many times because you get lovely anecdotes about how the women negotiated this changing space, how they were with each other, how they controlled from a place of complete invisibility. Because at this time, the parda was extremely strict. One of the women in the story, it is said, an elite woman from Delhi who sought refuge here, she was so strict in her parda that when her brother would come to visit her inside the zenana, she would first wrap her hands and feet in cloths, bind them so that he could really see nothing of her own brother. So imagine that these women are having to negotiate not only the Nawabs, who are doing their own thing, but foreign men, mercenaries, soldiers, the resident who's always trying to extract something. They are managing to communicate with them despite this parda. So how they do that, it's all there, in this source which is written from there. The other great finding for me was the French sources. Today we haven't touched on it, but the other great power in the 18th century was the French East India Company. Until about the 18th century, mid 18th century, they were poised equally with the British. We could have been having this conversation in French instead of English. So it was pretty evenly poised. And then a series of events happened again overseas, and that was the end of French ambition. But the fact remains that many, many mercenaries, soldiers, other Frenchmen were hanging around the country looking for employment in rich courts. So they came here to Awadh and they wrote enormous amounts of documents. They wrote their memoirs, they patronized art, and wrote books along with the art. So that was one source that I was able to use to counter, say, the British sources, because of course there's the Indian source, there's the British source, and now we have the French source to sort of give a balancing view to the British one. So when they are talking about, for example, there's a French traveler called the Count of Modave, and his own biographer says that he was spectacularly useless at every undertaking he took, and he was not able to accomplish anything materially, but he was a really clever, insightful man, and he wrote his memoirs. And he writes about Shuja'ud-Dawla side by side with the British, and you can compare and contrast and get such a vivid and different view of the Nawabs of Awadh by using this different source. So I think I've used, hopefully, sources which you might not find in a traditional account, and they're all listed at the back of my books for those who are interested.
Thank you. That was a very good question, and thank you, Ira. So, to find out if there is a possibility that we could be having this conversation in French, as I said, please take the book. And thank you once again. Thank you for restoring our faith in checkered past. And there was one thing that you said that I would like to end this session on, that visual culture, much like the various cultures that they patronized, was to bring us together, was to create a sense of familiarity, which is what we need to look at when we talk about history. So, thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you, Eric, for being here. It's very kind. Thank you.